the remarkable story of the friendship behind the most popular band in history.
There goes Stuart Sutcliffe. He could have been in the Beatles.
I love him, John.
Don't we all?
You are the director of Backbeat, now celebrating its 30th birthday with some very special 35mm screenings across Picture House. I wonder if we could start by you just telling anyone who doesn't know what Backbeat is, what it is.
Well, it's a story about three people, principally. Stuart Sutcliffe, who was a very talented art student in Liverpool in the early 60s. His best friend, John Lennon, who persuaded him to join their band as they were about to go to Liverpool. And the amazing German photographer, Astrid, who fell in love with Stuart. Stuart fell in love with her. And also John was sort of in love with both of them. So it's this triangle of friendship and love. And the way that it's an everyman story, really, about people pursuing their ambitions and deciding what they want to do with their lives, what they have to give up, sacrifices that they have to make, and the leap that they have to make, often a leap in the dark. And it all takes place in Hamburg on the eve of the Beatles' fame. So in many ways, it's a story where the characters in the story had no idea what was going to happen to them. And in that sense, it's almost like an everyman story that I think a lot of people can find a connection with.
Definitely. And I wonder if you could start also by explaining how you came across the interviews that inspired the original script that I think you wrote it some years before the actual filming, wasn't it?
Well, what happened was that I was aware of the Beatles, when I was at primary school.
Yeah.
It was a sort of a phenomenon, and it just like swept through the school. Everybody wanted the records, and there were even plastic Beatles haircut sort of wigs for sale in the local supermarkets. So it was very much something that I associated originally with my early life, and I was probably about 10 when my father bought Sgt. Pepper. It was that it was that much of a crossover. So I think I always associated with them. Of course, incredibly talented, incredibly influential. I saw the change that seemed to stem from them and the world around me. It was like the world before them was kind of rather grey and dull. But then I kind of moved on. But when I was at Granada Television, I'd always been super passionate about music and also about art. I used to paint and take photographs. I was working on the obituary of John Lennon because I was working at Granada Television with Tony Wilson of Hacienda and Factory Records fame, amongst others. I was just out of university. And I sort of delved into the archive. I was having to select the archive, and I was seeing that story and those people in a new light. But I wasn't really interested in telling a Beatles story. I was looking for a story about, coming of age and people pursuing their dreams. And I saw a photograph of Stuart and Astrid, and there was this very fashionable magazine at the time called The Face, very cool. And it looked like it was a photograph from The Face. Didn't look like something from the rather sort of, dull early 60s. And I thought, why haven't I heard of these people? They obviously, just by the look of them, there's this confidence, this kind of style, this intelligence. Astrid and Stuart, kind of an androgynous couple, wearing each other's clothes, very kind of, cross-dressing in the early 60s. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized it was the most amazing story. I tracked down Stuart's mother, by going through the old school, going through the phone books. And through her, I got a out-of-date phone number of Astrid Gierke in Hamburg. I think it was an ex-husband of hers. And rather reluctantly, he said, "Oh, well, I think she's working in a bar on the banks of the river in Hamburg." So I just, again, tracked down a number of bars, and I think the fourth or fifth I called, she answered. She was managing the bar, and had a very brief but rather, very friendly but rather guarded conversation. I think she was very wary of people just wanting to know, get more sensational stories about the Beatles in Hamburg and their exploits. And she said, look, if you're ever in Hamburg, then give me a call. So I went the next week and said, I'm here. And so she said, well, come and meet me at the bar. This is when my break is. And we talked for about an hour, and she was reassured, as she told me, that I was interested in their story, particularly the story of Stuart, who she and Klaus Voormann, who was the other person who Stuart and John met in Hamburg, that he also was very, very fond of, and sort of for them, Stuart's friendship was a very precious thing, even though in a way, Stuart stole Astrid from Klaus, because Klaus and Astrid were boyfriend and girlfriend at the time the Beatles arrived in Hamburg. So eventually, I got their agreement to do. I stayed with Klaus and Astrid. They weren't together, but I was invited up to Klaus's farmhouse in northern Germany, and Astrid came along. And I principally interviewed Astrid, stayed with them for about 7 or 8 days. And Klaus would sort of come in and and chip in from time to time, and that interview was the basis of the screenplay that I wrote.
What a wonderful story. And I think that was the key, wasn't it? That you weren't coming at it from wanting to tell the stories of the Beatles. It was like you're saying, that it was the everyman and the people behind it, and that wonderful youth movement, post-war, early 60s, that hadn't been contaminated by anything yet. And I think when I contacted you on email, I said I was so relieved when I saw Backbeat, because I remember just like whenever there was like a music in a film or musicians in films, there was just some sort of, oh, I don't know, terrible sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Stereotype about how a musician is portrayed and what goes on, just sort of fag smoking, lip curling, sort of, horror. And watching Backbeat, honestly, there are 2 things I'm so excited to talk to you about, because the first one, well, they're both equal importance, but Iain Hart and the soundtrack, and for me, it was just bliss to be bathed in both these things as a huge music fan, so which would you like to talk about first?
Well, let's talk about Iain, because he's sort of
Yes.
first. Iain Hart was introduced to me by one of the producers, Finola Dwyer, and he just appeared in a film called The Hours and the Times, which was a very different John Lennon to the John Lennon that I was aware of from my research. I mean, I knew people at Granada Television, including John Lennon's first girlfriend, Thelma McGough, who was called Thelma Pickles at the time. And they gave a different view of who Lennon was. He was very sort of, obviously he'd had the tragedy of losing his mother young. He was very short-sighted. He was quite defensive and aggressive because of that at the same time. Obviously, a very caring person and emotional inside, but sort of would hide that. And Stuart was really the only person that he would open up to. So when I met Stephen, when I met Iain, I was convinced that he was perfect for the role. He didn't look like John Lennon. I know people say he does, but he doesn't. But he embodied him and he became him. And he really became part of the team. And so we spent months and months and months trying to put the cast together. And Iain, I think, was living in London at the time. And even if he wasn't, he would come down from Liverpool and he would do the readings at the auditions when we were trying to cast Stuart Sutcliffe. So he was really, and he was very, very helpful to Stephen Dorff, who was our American actor who came over and really sort of clung to Iain. I mean, Stephen was quite young at the time. He was about 19. He was in this foreign country. He'd never been sort of far from LA before. And Iain took him under his wing, and they had a great relationship, which is really close to that love that the two of them had in the film. And it's kind of endured to today. But in the year or so after the film, they were just there the whole time. And whenever Ian's in LA, he sees Stephen. Whenever Stephen is in London, he hooks up with me and with Iain. So, but it was just an incredibly instinctive performance. And I told him, I said, I don't want you to imitate John Lennon. I don't want you to do your research looking at looking at photographs or archive footage or trying to imitate his voice. I want him to embody you. I want you to feel that he's you. So I want you to play it in a weird way, as if you're playing yourself, but you're playing the part, you're playing the scenes. You are yourself in this scene, and you are reacting in this scene, as if you really believe that you are this character. And I think that he probably didn't need me to tell him that, but that's exactly how he played it.
Do you know what? I used to have this theory as well that actors couldn't play musicians because they didn't know how to be themselves.
Yeah.
And musicians can't play actors because they don't know how to be anything other than themselves.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that you would say that was the directorial advice that you gave Iain Hart, because I don't think you can play someone like John Lennon unless you are literally screaming from your heart.
Yeah. And the other thing was that all the cast were musicians to some degree. Chris O'Neill, who played George Harrison, was a really great musician, and he's sort of, that's his career to even to this day. And Scot Williams, who played Pete Best, he learnt the drums really, really well. We had a great music supervisor, Bob Last, and we worked out that we wanted them to be a band. We really wanted them to feel that they were a band. So they shared rooms together in the run up to shooting. They rehearsed a hell of a lot. And in the last week or two before shooting, because we took over this area in London, which was the sets in the film. We built the sets. I mean, it was our costume department, it was our production offices. So everybody was there. So as soon as the sets were built, at the end of each day, the cast playing the Beatles would perform for the crew, for the rest of the crew and the rest of the cast. We had beers and we'd sit around in the tables, and it was like a gig every evening. So they became that band. And it was even things like, getting like, really being pernickety about what order they came on stage, and how the straps were on the guitars. So they really became like a band. And the way that I shot it is I wanted us to be with them at the beginning. So the camera is on the stage a lot with them. It follows them onto the stage. It's in the dressing rooms with them. And the more and more they kind of get closer to being the Beatles that we recognize, which is the last image of the film, is like almost like a sort of Beatles archive concert. We are sort of, we're with the audience now more. So it was really, music was hugely important. And even though we had the most amazing backing track, the band that we put together for the actors to mime against, they could all play the songs themselves anyway. So when they were miming, they weren't miming, they were singing, which of course meant that when we were editing the soundtrack voices with the actors, we were kind of combining. We didn't actually use, apart from on a couple of occasions, we didn't use the voices of the actors. We used Stephen Dorff when he was doing the Love Me Tender solo, and there's another song that we used the band for, the actors. But most of the time, they were, nevertheless, we recorded them singing. And so they were singing at the top of their voices, when they were in against the backing track. You asked about the backing track. Well, that was, I had this idea with the whole film. I didn't want to do a Beatles biopic. I didn't want it to be a look-alike. I didn't want it to be like Madame Tussauds. I didn't care what they look like. I mean, coincidentally, John, the actor Gary Bakewell, who played Paul McCartney, does look quite like Paul McCartney, but that wasn't an intention. And I just wanted, for a while, I mean, when I wrote it, I wanted it to work so that it almost worked if they weren't the Beatles. And when I wrote the first drafts, I changed the name. So they weren't John, Paul, and Pete and Stuart. I was just really trying to say this is a band like any other band at the beginning of their journey. And so because of that, I didn't want the soundtrack, the songs that we were going to record, to sound, I didn't want the musicians to try and sound like the Beatles. I wanted them just to approach the songs with the same attitude and aggression, and just kind of kick the hell out of the songs. So we realized that we also needed a deal, or it'd be great to get a deal. Virgin Records were interested. And it was clear that the way to get a deal was to have the best musicians we could, so we could do a soundtrack album. And the way to do that was to get a producer that everybody wanted to work with. So, I mean, a story that we've told a few times recently, which was that another one of our producers, Nick Powell, a very maverick guy, sadly no longer with us. He was Richard Branson's original partner, and he and Steve Woolley created Palace Pictures, that was a very rock and roll film company in the 90s. And he was rather like the character of Paul McCartney reading the Beano in the loo in the film. Nick was reading a magazine on the loo, and he rushed out of the loo saying, "It's got to be Don Was," because he'd read that Don Was the most in-demand producer. He was producing, I think it was Voodoo Lounge for the Stones at the time. So and that's what happened. I mean, Don absolutely wanted to do it. We said he could do the soundtrack as well. He did a brilliant soundtrack. But he got Dave Grohl on drums, Mike Mills on bass, Thurston Moore on guitar, Henry Rollins, Greg Darley from Afghan Wigs, and just in the studio for a day or two. And
Can I just interrupt there as well? Because I remember sitting in the cinema, listening to the soundtrack and thinking, these guys, I don't believe they're playing, but I can't see how they're not playing. So, but this soundtrack is phenomenal, and I remember then coming out and then looking it up and seeing who was in the band, and I was like, oh my God, I've just witnessed this extraordinary supergroup. I mean, what a treat.
Yeah, it was amazing. They were great too. And they're all very sort of, they've got affectionate, memories of the film. I did a Edith Bowman's great soundtracking podcast a few weeks ago, and it was me and Don Was, and it was just great to talk to Don. And it was like 30 years ago, but it was like it was yesterday when we were talking about it. And he's still an icon. And there was an MTV award ceremony in Radio City in New York when I was there shooting my next film, Hackers. So it was nice that I was able to go along, and they won soundtracks, best soundtrack songs and stuff, because it was, they were icons, as you say, at the time. And the music under Don's supervision is amazing.
And so tell me a bit more about the actual film itself. Like, I mean, one of my favorite standout images is Ian Hart in a pink tutu, just screaming off his head on whatever it is that Astrid gave them to try and stay awake. You captured the dirt and the grit and the hard graft that they put in, and that whole punk energy and ethos was just all there. Tell me about creating that feel and look.
Well, it came from Astrid and Klaus Voormann. Klaus Voormann was a musician at the time as well as an artist, and he became a huge friend of the Beatles after this period. It's his drawing that is the cover of Revolver, and he joined the Plastic Ono band. He famously plays bass guitar on the whole Imagine album, and he was a musician. He was a trained musician. And he came in, I think he'd had an argument with Astrid. And so he was walking down the Reeperbahn and he heard this music, and he said it literally hit him in the chest and knocked him over and blew him away. And he described it to me as a cross between punk and dance music. He said it was so physical and so kind of exciting and aggressive. He'd never heard anything like it. So we used that as our approach, not just to the music, but to how the band were, and that they were exhausted and they would start playing around. And originally, the early days, they were in this strip club, sharing billing with a stripper, which we show in the film. And gradually the audience became, they started to attract more of the art student scene, and other people were into it. They heard there was this thing going on. But before that, they were playing to a completely drunk, disinterested audience of mainly, sailors on leave. So they were just kind of having a laugh, and they were being forced to play longer and longer than they ever intended by Bruno Koschmider, the manager of the club, who was pushing them to the limits. And of course, that's probably one of the things that meant that they got honed really quickly into this amazing live band. I mean, John Lennon said afterwards, we were never as good as a live band as we were in Hamburg. So it was just, I just wanted that grit, and the whole punk thing, had just sort of, when I first had the idea of doing the film, it was not that long after the punk period as well. So I was just making that comparison. And also, I was very, very into music at the time. I would go to as much live music as I could, particularly since I was working and living in Manchester and visiting Liverpool. But it was almost like there was a period it felt like I went out and saw music every night, and I knew some of the bands, because they were starting out. Because we used to, I used to bring a lot of the bands into Granada and give them slots in Tony Wilson's show. So, and I had friends who were in bands, so I'd always loved that world. I've always been around that world, and I just wanted it to be that sort of really early stage of a career, in sort of small, smelly, unglamorous surroundings. And everything I read and everything I heard from that, from the people who were there, that's what their experience was at the time. And so when they met Astrid and Klaus, it was like this complete sort of different world that the curtains were drawn on, this world that was like European art and music. It was jazz, it was film, it was photography, it was everybody dressing in this, not just on a Saturday night when they wanted to go out and sort of dress up, for a night out, but it's almost like, this is our world now, this is our life, and this is who we are. And it kind of, I think, gave, through Stuart and then John, this idea that the band could use the kind of the visual arts as much as a part of what they wanted to say as their music.
Yes, they were unbelievably pioneering in so many ways beyond the music. I think, Berlin was obviously an epiphany on so many levels for them. Iain, it's not available on streaming, is it? And I love that. And I love that it's only available on 35mm print in Liverpool and Brighton at the moment.
Well, I hate to disappoint you.
Oh, is that not true? Okay.
It's available on Blu-ray. When we do show it, which is usually for anniversaries, every effort is made to show it on 35mm film. But it's about to be re-released, because it was available on streaming a while ago. I think the music rights lapsed, but Universal are about to clear all the music and re-release it again, which is another really appropriate thing for people that can't see it in the cinema. But it's no, as you know, film is my passion, so there is no substitute for experiencing any film, I think, in the cinema with a group, with an audience, where you go into that world, which is almost like an altered state. It's like a different state of existence. You're open to the storytelling, to the experience, to being immersed in it in a way that you can't replicate any other way. I think particularly for this film, where the intention was to make the audience to feel that they're there, that they're there in the clubs, that the music is present, the music is, so that it's like you're listening to the music in the cinema in the way that you would have listened to it if you were in the club.
100%. I cannot recommend it. For me, it was a really huge cinematic moment, and I can't recommend, and it was a long time ago, and it still is as resonant with me today as I'm discussing it with you, as it was then. So it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much, Iain. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in Brighton on the 25th of September at the Duke of York's to take this conversation further. And any last thoughts?
Well, just thank you so much for for taking the time and the interest that you and also Picture House have in helping us to celebrate the 30th anniversary. We had a screening in London. There's one in Liverpool next week, and then there's one in Brighton on the 25th. week after next. It's, you know, there'll be some people involved with the film who'll come along, and you know, we'll all be sticking around in the bar afterwards if anybody, you know, wants to talk to us further. But I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Iain. I look forward to seeing you then.
Yeah, see you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Picture House Cinema's unique video content. Hit the subscribe button to be kept up to date with our movie news, cast and crew interviews, highlights, trailers, and lots more.